Most Americans don't wake up thinking about the national debt, and that's understandable. Life is busy, bills are due, work deadlines pile up, kids need attention. The idea that a number in Washington could affect your daily life feels distant, almost abstract. But history shows us something uncomfortable. The biggest economic shifts usually don't begin with panic. They begin with indifference. And right now, America's growing debt sits squarely in that zone. Not a crisis, not an emergency, but not harmless either. Let's start with what actually changed. For years, the United States lived in a very specific financial environment. Interest rates were low, borrowing was cheap, debt felt manageable. In that world, the government could borrow trillions of dollars and still keep interest costs under control. But that environment is gone. Today, interest rates are higher, and that changes everything, even if the debt itself hasn't suddenly exploded overnight. The real shift isn't the debt number, it's the cost of carrying it. Why interest matters more than debt headlines. Most people hear $30+ trillion and tune out. It's too big to process. But here's the part that actually matters. The government doesn't need to pay the debt back all at once. It needs to service it continuously. That means paying interest, every year, automatically. And as old bonds mature and new ones are issued at higher rates, the interest bill grows, even if spending stays flat. This is where the pressure begins. Quietly. Something important most headlines don't explain. Interest on the national debt is now one of the fastest growing items in the federal budget. Not defense, not healthcare, not infrastructure. Interest. And unlike other spending, it's non-negotiable. You can debate a bill, you can delay a program, you can cut a department, you can't ignore interest payments. They get paid first. Why? This isn't just a government problem. At this stage, nothing breaks. There's no crash, no shutdown of daily life. But the system becomes tighter, less flexible, because every dollar that goes toward interest is a dollar that can't go somewhere else. And when choices become limited, trade-offs begin. That's when the effects slowly move from Washington into households. A subtle shift Americans should notice. When government borrowing increases in a higher rate environment, it competes with private borrowing. That affects mortgage rates, business loans, credit availability, not overnight, not dramatically, but persistently. It's like adding weight to a system that already feels strained. Pause here for a moment. This isn't about fear, it's about awareness. Because systems under pressure don't fail loudly at first. They change behavior. They limit options, they reshape incentives. And that's exactly what's starting to happen now. How government debt quietly reaches your household. When the federal government borrows more in a high interest rate environment, it doesn't borrow in isolation. It borrows from the same financial system that households and businesses rely on. That means Treasury bonds are competing for capital with home buyers, small businesses, corporate investment, state and local governments. When the government becomes a bigger borrower, money doesn't disappear. It just gets redirected. And that redirection has consequences. Why interest rates feel sticky. Many Americans noticed something frustrating over the last year. Inflation cooled a bit, but borrowing costs didn't come down the way people expected. Mortgage rates stayed high. Car loans stayed expensive. Credit tightened. This is part of why. Heavy government borrowing puts upward pressure on rates, even when inflation slows. It doesn't cause rates to spike suddenly. It keeps them elevated longer than people expect. That's the difference between a temporary shock and a structural drag. And right now, we're dealing with the second one. Inflation's quieter cousin. When people hear inflation, they usually imagine prices jumping quickly. But there's another version that's harder to notice. It's when prices don't fall back. When costs settle at a higher level and stay there. Debt plays a role in this. If policymakers rely too heavily on borrowing instead of restraint, inflation becomes a pressure valve, not a crisis, but a release. Savings lose purchasing power slowly. Wages struggle to keep up. Households adjust expectations downward. Nothing breaks. But life feels tighter. Why this hits middle-income households the hardest. Very wealthy households can absorb higher rates. Very low-income households rely on assistance programs. The squeeze happens in the middle. People with mortgages, retirement contributions, college savings, small investments, credit dependence, these households feel the pressure first. They're not collapsing, they're adjusting, delaying upgrades, postponing moves, spending more cautiously. That behavior adds up across millions of families, and that's how macro problems turn into economic slowdowns. The psychological effect nobody talks about. Debt doesn't just affect numbers, it affects confidence. When people feel uncertain about rates, prices, taxes, future policy, they become defensive. They save more, spend less, take fewer risks. That's rational behavior. But at scale, it slows growth. And slower growth makes debt harder to manage. That's the loop policymakers try to avoid, and often struggle to escape. Why this still isn't a crisis? Let's be clear. America is not on the edge of collapse. The system still works. Markets still function. The dollar still holds power. But stability doesn't mean comfort. It means the burden shifts slowly instead of violently. That's why this phase feels confusing. People sense something is off, but can't point to a single moment when it broke. A key question Americans should consider. Here's the real issue. If more and more national resources go towards servicing past decisions, what gets less attention? Innovation, infrastructure, education, tax relief? Debt doesn't eliminate choices. It narrows them. And narrowing choices is how long-term economic character changes. Take a breath here. Again, this isn't about fear. It's about understanding why things feel heavier than they used to, even when headlines say conditions are improving. Because improvement at the surface doesn't always mean relief underneath. Up to this point, we've talked about debt as pressure, pressure on borrowing, pressure on households, pressure on confidence. Now, let's talk about where this pressure shows up next: work, wages, and opportunity. Because this is where long-term consequences quietly take shape. How debt changes the job market without layoffs. Most people expect economic stress to show up as layoffs. Sometimes it does, but more often, it shows up as something subtler. Companies don't necessarily fire people. They stop expanding. They pause hiring. They delay raises. They postpone long-term projects. From the outside, everything looks fine, but underneath, momentum slows. Why higher government borrowing affects private jobs. When borrowing costs stay elevated, businesses face trade-offs. A company that once planned to build a new facility, expand into a new market, invest in productivity now has to reconsider. Not because the idea is bad, but because financing it costs more. That doesn't kill jobs immediately, it limits future jobs. And future jobs are where wage growth usually comes from. The productivity problem most people don't connect to debt. Here's something rarely discussed outside economic circles. Long-term wage growth depends on productivity, and productivity depends on investment. When capital flows more heavily toward government debt, especially at attractive rates, it becomes less available for riskier, growth-driven projects. That means fewer efficiency upgrades, slower innovation adoption, less output per worker. Over time, wages flatten. Not because workers are less skilled, but because the system isn't investing as aggressively as it once did. Why this feels like working harder for the same result. Many Americans already feel this. Working more hours, taking on more responsibility, seeing less progress. That feeling doesn't come from one policy or one year. It comes from cumulative drag. Debt contributes to that drag by reshaping incentives across the economy. The generational angle nobody wants to talk about. This is where age matters. Older workers are closer to retirement. Younger workers are still building. But the burden lands hardest on those in the middle, people trying to grow careers while managing mortgages, families, and savings. If growth slows during these years, the effects compound. Less wage growth means lower lifetime earnings, smaller retirement contributions, reduced flexibility later in life. Again, nothing collapses. But opportunity narrows. Why this doesn't show up clearly in headlines? Economic reporting focuses on snapshots. Jobs added this month, inflation this quarter, markets this week. Debt's impact doesn't show up well in snapshots. It shows up in trajectories, slower progress, fewer upside surprises, more caution everywhere. That's harder to explain, and easier to ignore. A hard truth about managing debt: there's a belief that as long as debt is managed, it doesn't matter. That's partly true. But managing debt isn't just about avoiding disaster. It's about preserving room to grow. When more national income goes toward servicing the past, less goes toward building the future. That's not ideology, that's arithmetic. Let's pause on something important. This isn't a story about blame. Every modern economy deals with debt. The real question is how long a system can rely on borrowing before it starts limiting its own potential. And that question becomes more relevant the longer high rates stick around. Why this matters now, not later. If interest rates had fallen quickly, much of this pressure would ease. But if rates remain elevated, even moderately, these effects compound. That's why this moment matters. Not because of panic, but because of path dependence. Once systems adjust to slower growth, reversing that trend becomes harder. By now, a pattern should be clear. America's debt problem isn't about tomorrow. It's about trajectory. And trajectories matter more than moments. So let's step back and look at what the next 5 to 10 years could realistically look like if current trends continue. Not worst-case scenarios, not optimistic fantasies, just plausible outcomes. The slow trade-off most people won't notice at first. When debt servicing takes up a growing share of national resources, the trade-offs don't arrive all at once. They arrive quietly. Budgets become harder to balance. Every new proposal faces tighter scrutiny. Spending debates become more intense, not because priorities change, but because flexibility shrinks. In that environment, governments tend to favor short-term relief, politically safe spending, delaying structural reforms. Long-term investments become harder to justify, even when they're necessary. That's how future growth gets postponed. Why the U.S. still looks strong on the surface? Here's the part that confuses people. Even under strain, the United States can still look relatively strong compared to other countries. The dollar remains dominant. Capital still flows into U.S. markets. Institutions still function. That creates a sense of insulation. And to a degree, that insulation is real, but insulation doesn't mean immunity. It means the adjustment process is slower and often less visible. The risk of becoming comfortably constrained. There's a phrase economists sometimes use: a system that is stable but constrained. Growth continues, but modestly. Opportunities exist, but fewer. Progress happens, but slowly. That's a very different future from collapse, but it's also very different from dynamism. Over 5 to 10 years, that kind of environment reshapes expectations. People plan smaller. Businesses take fewer risks. Innovation slows at the margin, not dramatically, persistently. What this means for the American middle class: this is where long-term debt becomes personal. In a constrained growth environment, wage increases become harder to secure, job mobility declines, housing affordability improves slowly, if at all. Retirement planning becomes more sensitive to small changes. Households don't fail, they adapt. And adaptation often means accepting less upward movement than previous generations expected. The political feedback loop. Debt also changes politics, even when people don't consciously think about it. As fiscal space shrinks, every policy debate becomes more polarized. Trade-offs feel harsher. Compromise becomes harder. That doesn't happen because people suddenly become unreasonable. It happens because the room to give everyone something gets smaller. Over time, this erodes trust, not just in leaders, but in outcomes. Why delay is the default response? If this problem is so clear, why doesn't it get addressed aggressively? Because structural solutions are uncomfortable. They involve reprioritizing spending, adjusting expectations, asking current voters to accept long-term benefits. Politically, delay is often safer, especially when consequences are gradual rather than immediate. The danger of waiting too long: delaying reform doesn't cause instant failure. It increases future constraints. It narrows options. And when action finally becomes unavoidable, it's often more painful than it needed to be. That's the real risk. Not collapse, but lost optionality. A moment of perspective: historically, countries don't get weaker because of one mistake. They get weaker because of accumulated trade-offs that were easier to postpone than to confront. America still has choices, but choices are time-sensitive, And the longer trends continue unchecked, the more those choices get limited. Where this leaves us, the next 5 to 10 years aren't predetermined, but they will be shaped by whether policymakers prioritize resilience over short-term comfort, and whether citizens pay attention before the pressure becomes unavoidable. Up to now, we've talked about pressure building slowly, debt increasing, flexibility shrinking, growth becoming harder to sustain. The obvious question is, if this path isn't sustainable forever, what actually forces change? Because history tells us something important. Large systems almost never reform voluntarily while they still function. They reform when pressure becomes unavoidable. What usually triggers action, there isn't just one trigger. More often, it's a combination of stresses that converge. That can include persistently high interest costs, slower economic growth, rising political tension around budgets, market signals that confidence is weakening. None of these alone cause a breaking point. Together, they narrow the room to maneuver. That's when reform stops being optional. The role of financial markets are often misunderstood. They don't panic easily. They also don't wait forever. As long as investors believe, the system is stable, institutions will adjust, long-term value is preserved, capital continues to flow, but confidence is conditional. If doubts grow about fiscal discipline or political capacity to respond, markets begin demanding higher compensation for risk. That shows up as higher borrowing costs, reduced tolerance for delays, less forgiveness for uncertainty. This isn't punishment, it's pricing. Why adjustment usually happens under stress? Policymakers prefer gradual solutions. Markets often force faster ones. When interest costs consume too much fiscal space, trade-offs become unavoidable. At that point, leaders face choices they have avoided: restructuring spending, revisiting tax structures, redefining priorities. These decisions are rarely popular, but pressure changes incentives. The misconception about control. There's a belief that governments fully control outcomes. In reality, control is shared with markets, demographics, productivity, external conditions. Debt reduces leverage over these forces. The more constrained the system becomes, the fewer tools remain effective. That's why timing matters. Acting early preserves options. Acting late limits them. How systems actually adjust. Adjustment doesn't usually look dramatic. It looks like gradual fiscal tightening, slower benefit expansion, higher tolerance for inflation, increased reliance on growth assumptions. Over time, expectations shift. People adapt to lower real returns, higher costs of capital, more cautious policy environments. Again, not collapse. Recalibration. Who bears the adjustment cost? This part is uncomfortable. Adjustment costs are rarely distributed evenly. They tend to fall on future taxpayers, savers facing reduced purchasing power, workers in slower growth sectors. The system protects stability first. Efficiency and fairness come later. That's not moral judgment. That's how complex systems preserve continuity. Why this phase feels politically tense. When adjustment begins, disagreement intensifies. Not because solutions don't exist, but because every solution has trade-offs, and trade-offs are easier to argue about than to accept. That's why periods of fiscal pressure often coincide with political polarization, policy gridlock, rising distrust. It's not a coincidence, it's a symptom. A key insight Americans should understand. Change rarely happens because leaders suddenly become brave. It happens because circumstances remove the ability to postpone. That's true in economics, politics, and personal finance. And the earlier a system adapts, the less painful that adaptation tends to be. Where this leaves the United States, America still has advantages. Strong institutions, economic depth, global influence. Those advantages create time, but time is a resource. And like any resource, it can be used wisely or slowly exhausted. At this point, one thing should be clear. America's debt situation is not a headline problem. It's not a breaking news problem. It's not even a political talking point problem. It's a structural reality. And structural realities don't demand attention loudly. They reshape the environment slowly. Why most people won't notice the turning point? Here's something worth sitting with. There is rarely a single moment when people say, "This is when things changed." Instead, years later, they look back and say, things used to feel easier than this. That's how long-term pressure works, not through shock, through accumulation. What this means for individual Americans, for most households, the right response isn't fear, it's awareness. Understanding that borrowing may stay more expensive than it once was, growth may feel slower than past decades, financial flexibility matters more than optimism. This doesn't mean giving up on progress. It means planning with clearer expectations. The difference between resilience and comfort: comfort assumes the system will absorb every shock. Resilience assumes shocks will happen and prepares for them. Nations that remain strong over time tend to shift from comfort to resilience before they're forced to. That applies to governments, it applies to markets, and it applies to households. Why this conversation matters now, not because disaster is imminent, but because this is the phase where outcomes are still shapeable. When systems feel mostly fine, that's when small adjustments matter most. Once pressure becomes obvious, choices become narrower. A quiet but important reminder: debt is not just about money, it's about future flexibility, the ability to respond to crises, the ability to invest in opportunity, the ability to adapt without panic. Every dollar committed to servicing the past is a dollar not shaping the future. That trade-off doesn't make headlines, but it defines trajectories. Most Americans don't need to obsess over the national debt, but ignoring it entirely isn't wise either, because the most influential forces in an economy are often the least dramatic ones. They work slowly, they compound quietly, and they shape the world people live in, long before anyone calls it a crisis. That's why this isn't about alarm. It's about paying attention,